I think it's safe to say under President Biden that number went up by about 8 million, which means almost certainly it's over 15 million. There are some muddled up people here who claim that all we should do is remove the illegal immigrants if they are breaking the law. That obviously makes no sense. I applaud President Trump and Kristi Noem for trying to remove all people who are here illegally. Otherwise, we have no immigration law in the first place, right? If you come here illegally and all you have to do is avoid committing a serious crime, we have no country, and we will, in our next president, wind up getting another 8 to 10 million people crossing here, together with the increased welfare cost, housing cost, and government services it applies, and together with the change in culture in the United States away from the...
You just watched a sitting member of Congress articulate what amounts to an authoritarian fever dream wrapped in the bloodless language of policy, and the moral vertigo should leave you breathless, because this is the moment where the veneer of respectability completely shatters and reveals the grotesque machinery beneath, the clockwork of cruelty that the Republican Party has spent decades constructing and is now celebrating with confetti made from deportation orders and families torn asunder. Glenn Grothman stands before cameras praising Trump and Kristi Noem for pursuing policies that would constitute the largest human rights catastrophe enacted by an American government in modern history, and he does so with the bland affect of someone discussing zoning regulations, the bureaucratic banality that Hannah Arendt warned us about when she traced the lineage of state violence back to men in suits pushing papers and convincing themselves they were merely following procedure, merely enforcing law, merely protecting borders, as if the abstraction could sanitize the barbarism. But here's where we need to hold on to your seats, because the Trump administration has already removed over 500,000 people, with DHS announcing they're on pace to deport nearly 600,000 by the end of the first year. By the end, this isn't speculation or campaign rhetoric anymore, but a machine that's whirring at full capacity. They want us talking about it. They want immigrants to be afraid. And in Charlotte, 15% of kids in one school district didn't show up to school because the terror has already accomplished its objective. Think about that statistic for just 1 second. Let it sink into your bones. Children too frightened to attend school in the United States of America because federal agents are conducting what advocacy organizations are calling urban terror operations, going through areas where they think immigrants are living and working, arresting or pulling over anyone they think looks undocumented. This is racial profiling codified into enforcement strategy, and the Supreme Court explicitly signed off on stopping someone based on whether they seem undocumented, including considering their race, in what's become known as a Kavanaugh stop, named after the justice who rubber-stamped this constitutional abomination. And we're just getting warmed up because Grothman's argument demands we examine its foundation, the intellectual rot at its core that masquerades as logic. He claims with the confidence of someone reciting multiplication tables that if you come here illegally, and all you have to do is avoid committing a serious crime, we have no immigration law in the first place, and we have no country, as though human civilization itself hangs by the thread of maximalist deportation enforcement, as though nations only exist when they're actively expelling millions of people, as though the concept of sovereignty requires the systematic destruction of families who've built lives here for decades. This is the language of emergency, of existential crisis manufactured to justify the unjustifiable, and it echoes across history with chilling familiarity because authoritarians always need their invasions, their infestations, their dangerous others who threaten the very essence of the nation's existence and must be rooted out with maximum force and minimum mercy. Here comes the economic bombshell that should detonate every single premise of Grothman's argument, because while he's complaining about welfare costs and housing costs and government services, undocumented immigrant households paid $89.8 billion in federal, state, and local taxes in 2023 and held $299 billion in spending power. Let me repeat that because it bears repeating until every American understands it. Undocumented immigrants paid $59.4 billion in federal and $13.6 billion in state and local taxes in 2022, including $25.7 billion in Social Security taxes, $6.4 billion in Medicare taxes, and $1.8 billion in unemployment insurance programs for which they are ineligible. They are funding the retirement of Americans who want them deported. They are paying into systems they can never access. They are subsidizing the very government apparatus that Grothman wants to use to hunt them down and expel them. The economic illiteracy required to claim immigrants are draining public coffers is staggering. It requires ignoring every credible economic analysis conducted in the last 2 decades, And that's before we even get to the catastrophic consequences of mass deportation itself. Wait until you hear what mass deportation would actually do to this economy, because the numbers are so devastating, they should make every rational person recoil in horror. Mass deportation could depress national wage and salary income by $317.2 billion, or 2.7% of labor income, and that's not some progressive think tank's wild estimate, but rigorous economic modeling that accounts for labor market dynamics and complementarity effects. For every 1 million unauthorized immigrant workers deported, 88,000 U.S. native workers are driven out of employment, because surprise, surprise, the economy isn't a zero-sum game where one person's job loss automatically creates another person's job gain. It's an interconnected system where immigrant labor creates demand that sustains American workers' employment. Estimates show mass deportation would shrink the U.S. economy by nearly 6%, resulting in a loss of $1.6 trillion. And that's an economic catastrophe on par with the Great Recession, except this time it would be entirely self-inflicted, a wound carved into the body politic by ideological zealots wielding the knife of nativism. But here's where the cruelty becomes crystalline, where the human cost emerges from behind the statistics and demands recognition, because nearly 4 million mixed-status families, including 8.5 million U.S. citizens, 5.1 million of whom are children, would face traumatic separations with family members enduring immense emotional and economic hardship, losing loved ones and primary income earners. We are talking about American children, U.S. citizens with every right that citizenship supposedly confers, watching their parents dragged away by federal agents, growing up in foster care, or with relatives while their mothers and fathers are expelled to countries some of these children have never even visited. There are 4.7 million mixed-status households, and nearly 4 million include a U.S. citizen, with 9.7 million U.S. citizens living in households with undocumented residents. This isn't about illegal immigrants in the abstract, it's about your neighbor, your coworker's spouse, your child's classmate's parent. It's about people embedded in the fabric of American communities who contribute labor and taxes and culture and love. And you want to talk about changing culture like Grothman does with that loaded phrase dripping with xenophobic anxiety. Let's discuss culture, because almost 1 in 4 entrepreneurs in the country are immigrants, and about 46% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children. So apparently the culture they're bringing includes innovation, entrepreneurship, and the foundational companies that define American economic leadership. Undocumented immigrants account for 50% of all hired field and crop workers, making them essential to the success and continued viability of American farms, which means when Grothman sits down to eat his dinner tonight, there's a very good chance undocumented labor picked those vegetables and harvested that fruit. But apparently contributing essential agricultural labor doesn't count as the right kind of cultural contribution in the Republican imagination, because the culture they're actually worried about isn't economic contribution, but demographic composition. The fear encoded in the phrase replacement theory, that dare not speak its name in polite congressional hearings, but pulses beneath every word about cultural change. Now here comes the legal and humanitarian catastrophe that's already unfolding in real time, as Trump's second administration implements exactly what Grothman is praising, because only 30% of those in detention had criminal convictions, with 27% having pending criminal charges, and only 8.5% of those with criminal records were for violent offenses, while non-criminal ICE arrests jumped more than 800% since April. Grothman claims this is about removing people who break laws, but the reality is that internal ICE statistics show less than 10% of immigrants in ICE custody since October 2024 had criminal offenses, and 65% detained by ICE had no criminal convictions, with 93% having no violent convictions. This is mass criminalization without actual criminality. It's turning human beings into legal abstractions that can be processed through a deportation pipeline. ICE's acting director says needs to function like Amazon, trying to get your product delivered in 24 hours, except the product is human beings, and the delivery destination is forced removal from the only home many have ever known. The financial cost of this authoritarian project should make every fiscal conservative blanch, but Republicans have never actually cared about deficits when it comes to funding cruelty, and permanent deportation would cost an additional $900 billion over the first 10 years. According to Penn Wharton's rigorous budget modeling, the deportation process, arresting, detaining, processing, and removing costs an average of $70,136 per deportee. And that's before you factor in the economic contraction, the lost tax revenue, the downstream effects on communities suddenly bereft of workers and consumers and neighbors. These are resources that could build housing, fund education, provide health care, address climate change, but instead they're being redirected toward a maximalist enforcement regime whose primary purpose is satisfying the nativist ide of the Republican base and the white nationalist fantasies that Trump rode into power. But wait, because there's a deeper authoritarian turn here that should chill anyone who values constitutional democracy, and it's embedded in how this enforcement is actually happening on the ground. A Tufts graduate student was arrested on the street by masked men in plainclothes, learning days later her status had been revoked on grounds that her presence might undermine U.S. foreign policy by indicating support for a designated terrorist organization, with the only evidence being an op-ed she co-authored urging the university to recognize the war in Gaza as genocide. Immigration enforcement has become a tool for suppressing dissent, for punishing protected speech, for targeting activists who challenge American foreign policy. And this is how authoritarianism metastasizes. It starts with the most vulnerable populations, those without citizenship's protection, and then expands its reach to encompass anyone who threatens the political order. The humanitarian crisis is already here. It's not hypothetical, and CNN documented a new family separation crisis, as ICE isn't giving some parents enough time to make arrangements for their U.S. citizen children before deportation, and the number of people who have died in ICE detention this year appears to have grown to 16. People are dying in federal custody, children are being separated from parents, and even those who made appointments via CBP-1 or had partial protection were denied asylum, with Trump squeezing shut even the narrow opening for humanitarian protection. The Trump administration has taken over 1 million people who had done everything the right way, finding sponsors, waiting for appointments, applying for and renewing TPS, and made them illegal, meaning the number without legal status has almost certainly increased since January 2025. This is the opposite of law and order. It's chaos imposed from above. It's the capricious revocation of protections that destroys any semblance of a functional legal immigration system and replaces it with arbitrary enforcement that prioritizes spectacle over substance. And let's return to Grothman's specific framing, because it reveals the totalizing logic of Republican immigration policy, the rejection of any middle ground between open borders and mass expulsion. He dismisses as muddled the position that we should prioritize deporting immigrants who commit serious crimes, calling it obviously nonsensical, which means in his framework, there is no distinction between someone who commits murder and someone whose only violation is crossing a border without authorization. This is the flattening of moral categories that enables mass atrocity, the refusal to recognize gradations of harm or conduct proportional enforcement, the insistence that all undocumented immigrants are equally deportable, regardless of their ties to community, their contributions to society, their family relationships, their length of residence. It's an eliminationist rhetoric that treats millions of human beings as a categorical problem requiring a categorical solution. And we've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. We know where it leads when governments decide entire classes of people must be removed for the nation to survive. The white nationalist subtext isn't even subtext anymore when Grothman warns about the change in culture in the United States away from the culture that we've had. Because what culture did we have exactly? The culture of settler colonialism and indigenous genocide, the culture of chattel slavery and Jim Crow, the culture that excluded Chinese immigrants with racist legislation and interned Japanese Americans during World War II. American culture has always been contested terrain, always been defined by struggle between those who envision an expansive multiracial democracy and those who cling to white supremacist fantasies of ethnic purity. And when Republicans talk about cultural change, they're mourning the declining white majority, they're expressing demographic panic, coded in the language of tradition and heritage and values, but ultimately rooted in the fear that people who don't look like them are claiming equal citizenship and power. Here's the part where we need to talk about resistance because the stakes are civilizational. They're about what kind of country we're going to be, and whether we're going to let an authoritarian movement use immigration enforcement as the entering wedge for dismantling democratic norms and constitutional protections. A Gallup poll showed a steep drop among Republicans wanting immigration levels decreased, falling from 88% in 2024 down to 48% in June, and by April 2025, multiple polls found that the majority of Americans thought deportations went too far. Public opinion is already shifting against the cruelty. People are watching family separations and workplace raids and communities torn apart and recoiling from the violence, but that won't matter unless we organize, unless we protest, unless we make the political cost of mass deportation so high that even Republicans in swing districts have to distance themselves from Trump's maximalist policies. Grothman invokes Trump and Noem like patron saints of enforcement, praising them for trying to remove all people who are here illegally, and Kristi Noem as Homeland Security Secretary claims the Trump administration has made historic strides after DHS was hamstrung for 4 years, which is propaganda so disconnected from reality, it would be comical if it weren't justifying genuine humanitarian catastrophe. Under Biden, encounters at the southwestern border rose to 2.5 million in FY 2023, putting the U.S. on pace for 3.1 million encounters in FY 2024. And while those numbers represented real policy challenges that the Biden administration struggled to address effectively, the solution to administrative dysfunction isn't authoritarian mass expulsion, but comprehensive reform that creates legal pathways, addresses root causes of migration, and acknowledges the reality that millions of undocumented immigrants are never leaving because they are Americans in every sense except the paperwork. The economic modeling keeps coming back to haunt Republican talking points because deportation reduces wages of high-skilled workers comprising 63% of workers, and authorized low-skilled workers can see wages increase but only if deportation is permanently sustained after 4 years. Which means even under the most optimistic scenario for Native workers who Republicans claim to be protecting, they only benefit after sustained mass expulsion that causes catastrophic economic damage to everyone else. This is cutting off your nose to spite your face on a national scale. It's choosing symbolic purity over material prosperity. It's the politics of cultural resentment overriding any semblance of rational policymaking, and it's being sold by people like Grothman, who package eliminationist rhetoric in the bloodless language of border security and rule of law. The infrastructure of detention is expanding with terrifying speed as ICE awarded a contract worth up to $3.85 billion to operate a detention camp at Fort Bliss Army Base, with GEO Group getting a $1 billion contract for 1,000 beds in New Jersey and another for 1,800 beds in Michigan, and Core Civic winning a contract to house 2,400 people and families in Texas. GEO's stock price has soared 94% since Trump was elected, because mass human suffering is a growth industry for private prison companies whose entire business model depends on keeping detention beds filled, who lobby for harsher enforcement precisely because cruelty is profitable. This is the carceral state's logical endpoint, the fusion of nativist ideology with profit motive with state power, creating incentive structures that push toward maximalist detention and deportation, because that's what generates revenue for the contractors and satisfies the base for the politicians. Every word Grothman speaks about protecting America rings hollow when you understand that studies indicate undocumented immigrants are not displacing U.S.-born workers, but rather are filling jobs that few Americans are interested in pursuing, with immigrants competing for different low-skilled jobs than native workers. Economists do not tend to find that immigrants cause any sizable decrease in wages and employment of U.S.-born citizens, and instead may raise wages and lower prices in the aggregate, according to comprehensive literature reviews by the Brookings Institution and other research organizations. The jobs argument is a smokescreen. It's always been a smokescreen, because the real issue for people like Grothman isn't labor market competition but demographic anxiety, the terror of becoming a minority in a country they believe belongs to them by right of birth and blood and race. And the legal framework being used to justify this is equally terrifying, because Trump promised to launch the largest deportation program of criminals, using the U.S. military and the Alien Enemies Act, a 1798 law that gives the president power to detain immigrants during times of war. We are watching a president invoke statutes from the 18th century designed for actual military conflict between nation-states to justify domestic law enforcement against immigrants, stretching presidential authority to its breaking point and beyond, testing whether the courts will impose any meaningful limits on executive power when that power is wielded against the most vulnerable. This is how democracies die, not in dramatic coups but through the steady accumulation of extraordinary powers justified by manufactured emergencies that never quite end. The human stories behind these statistics should break your heart if you have any capacity for empathy left, and over half of the undocumented population are long-term residents having lived in the U.S. for 10 or more years, and as each person stays longer, their impact and ties to their community only strengthen, increasing the potential disruptions their removal supposes. We're talking about people who've been here for a decade or more, who've raised children here, bought homes here, built businesses here, become part of the community fabric in ways that make their removal not just cruel, but fundamentally destabilizing to everyone around them. Nearly 1.5 million households with at least one undocumented person have mortgages, and deportation would likely cause default on a significant percentage, threatening the U.S. housing market with destabilization. This isn't abstract policy, it's economic demolition with a humanitarian crisis layered on top. When Grothman says otherwise we have no country, He's weaponizing nationalist sentiment to justify what amounts to ethnic cleansing light, the forced removal of millions of people who've integrated into American society, who contribute to American prosperity, who love their American children and American communities, all because their initial entry violated administrative law. The proportionality here is so wildly skewed that it reveals enforcement as punishment for its own sake, cruelty as the point rather than a regrettable byproduct. And that's what makes Trumpism uniquely dangerous. It's not pursuing harsh immigration policy in service of some larger economic or security objective. It's pursuing harsh immigration policy because the base gets a visceral thrill from watching the powerless suffer, because white nationalist politics requires visible enemies being visibly dominated to sustain its emotional core. The international dimension adds another layer of horror because the administration plays hardball with countries to force them to accept deportation flights, threatening visa sanctions, while embracing repressive leaders like El Salvador's Nayib Bukele, who assist with getting people out of the United States. American foreign policy is being restructured around deportation logistics, with human rights concerns subordinated to removal capacity. The State Department will reportedly no longer criticize countries for returning people to persecution or preventing residents from leaving, and the administration has dealt the final blow to U.S. commitment to the Refugee Convention by militarizing the border. We are watching the systematic dismantling of America's humanitarian obligations under international law, the repudiation of refugee protections that emerged from World War II's horrors, the transformation of the United States from flawed asylum provider to aggressive deportation regime that treats refugee protection as obstacle rather than obligation. Grothman's praise for this nightmare is revealing because it shows how completely the Republican Party has internalized authoritarian values, how thoroughly they've abandoned even the pretense of compassionate conservatism or pro-family politics when it comes to immigrant families. Every single Republican policy priority gets inverted when applied to immigrants. They claim to support family values while ripping families apart. They claim to oppose government overreach while building a massive surveillance and detention apparatus. They claim to champion economic freedom while destroying the livelihoods of millions of productive workers. They claim to defend constitutional rights while embracing racial profiling and expedited removal without due process. The hypocrisy is so naked it stops being hypocrisy and becomes something else. The articulation of in-group protection and out-group punishment as the only consistent principle, the belief that rights and dignity are reserved for those deemed truly American, while everyone else exists at the state's discretion subject to arbitrary expulsion. We're living through authoritarian stress test of American institutions, and so far those institutions are failing catastrophically, with courts issuing injunctions that the administration simply ignores, with Congress unable or unwilling to check executive power, with media outlets both siding a humanitarian crisis because they're terrified of being accused of bias. A whistleblower complaint alleged misconduct, including misleading courts, willfully violating injunctions, keeping information about injunctions from agencies, and making arguments known to be false, with the whistleblower fired after refusing to sign a brief with untrue assertions. The rule of law is being shredded from within by officials who view legal constraints as obstacles to be evaded rather than boundaries to be respected, and that should terrify anyone who understands that rights are only as strong as the institutions that enforce them and the officials who honor them. The climate and conditions that enable this politics of cruelty demand examination because they didn't emerge from nowhere. They're the culmination of decades of conservative movement building that constructed alternate reality media ecosystems, gerrymandered legislatures to entrench minority rule, packed courts with ideological loyalists, and most importantly convinced millions of Americans that immigrants represent existential threat rather than fellow human beings worthy of dignity and compassion. Grothman can praise mass deportation in a congressional setting because he knows his voters have been marinating in anti-immigrant propaganda for years, because Fox News and talk radio have constructed a narrative where immigrants are simultaneously lazy welfare recipients and job-stealing workers, criminal threats and cultural corruptors, and that narrative has been internalized so deeply that even obvious contradictions don't register as contradictions, but reinforce the underlying emotional truth: immigrants are bad, America is being invaded, something must be done, and anyone who opposes maximum enforcement is complicit in national suicide. The final piece of this authoritarian puzzle is how mass deportation enables broader repression, because once you've normalized massive federal enforcement operations targeting millions of people based on legal status, you've created infrastructure and precedent for targeting any group the government deems problematic. The detention camps, the expanded surveillance, the deputized local police, the military involvement, the expedited processing without judicial review, All of this becomes available for redeployment against other populations. And that's not paranoid speculation, but historical pattern repeated across authoritarian regimes that begin by targeting vulnerable minorities and expand their repressive apparatus until it encompasses anyone who challenges state power. Immigration enforcement is the thin edge of the fascist wedge, the acceptable authoritarian practice that normalizes techniques and technologies and legal frameworks that can later be turned against citizens who dissent or organize or resist. When you watch Grothman praise Trump and Noem for pursuing mass deportation, when you hear him reject any enforcement priorities that distinguish between violent criminals and paperwork violations, when you listen to him invoke cultural change as justification for mass expulsion, you're not watching a policy debate, you're watching the normalization of eliminations politics, the transformation of millions of human beings into an administrative problem requiring an administrative solution, and we know from history where this leads. We know what happens when governments decide entire categories of people are incompatible with national survival and must be removed for the nation to thrive. This is the Republican Party in 2025, stripped of euphemism and dog whistles, explicit in its authoritarian ambitions, and the only question remaining is whether Americans who believe in democracy and human rights and constitutional governance will organize the sustained resistance necessary to stop this machine before it grinds millions more people through its bureaucratic teeth.